I'm going to start today with just the definition of sham peer review. I'm sure most of you probably know what it means, but here's the official published definition. Sham peer review is an adverse action taken in bad faith by a professional review body for some purpose other than the furtherance of quality health care, and that is disguised to look like legitimate peer review. And there's a whole lot of bad faith motives underlying sham peer review that I've encountered. And again, this is not an all-exhaustive list, and I'll just tick through them quickly. Retaliation against a physician whistleblower, anti-competitive motives, conflicts of interest, turf battles, politics, power struggles, professional jealousy. If patients like you a lot, your competitors may not like that and decide you got to go. Personal animus, discrimination, strategic business plans that don't include the targeted physician. What does that mean? Well, there's a nationwide purge that's going on right now where hospitals are getting rid of independent physicians, trying to make them all employed physicians under the hospital's complete control. And as I ran the AAPS sham peer review hotline, I began noticing that the same devious tactics that were used on the East Coast were the very same ones used on the West Coast, were the very same devious tactics used in the middle of the country. And so I sort of cataloged those and published them in our journal. You won't find any other medical journal anywhere that has published the tactics characteristic of sham peer review. It's in the AAPS journal. And I'm not going to go through these because I've given talks on these specific tactics. It's in the printout of slides on in your packet. And but I will tell you that all of the things that these tactics have in common is they violate due process and fundamental fairness for the physician who's subject of peer review. And again, you can look at those in on the printout of slides in your packet. Here's some more of them. And here's what I call actions frequently seen in association with sham peer review: switching prosecutorial theories during peer review from quality of care concerns to so-called professional conduct issues. That happens a lot. The hospital realizes they got kind of a weak case trying to make you out as an incompetent doctor, so they're just going to switch to something more subjective, like conduct issues. The pot calling the kettle black, this is where the accusers are often have even worse outcomes or higher infection rates than the doctor they're accusing of having high infection rates. A hospital board or MEC overruling recommendations of peer review committees, steering patients away from the targeted physician, and what I call assassination of professional reputation by PowerPoint, which is often done by attorneys representing hospitals making presentations to the MEC about what a bad doctor the doctor is. Here are some new bold tactics: the thought police. One of the reasons an AAPS member lost his privileges was based on the thought police, where the individuals on the peer review committees and hearing panel thought they knew what the doctor was thinking better than he did, even though he tried to explain that wasn't what I was thinking at all. So you've got thought police out there. You've got star chamber proceedings, where a certain group of elite physicians, maybe 3 or 4, get together in secret behind closed doors in a room. There is no peer review hearing given to the physician who's targeted. They make a determination of guilt, for example. They apply the punishment, and the only hearing that is afforded to the physician then is a hearing to see if he complied with the punishment. That's it. I call that star chamber proceedings. Medical staff bylaws, which allow the board to vote on the guilt of a physician prior to any fair hearing or appeal. And then again, there's the abuse of the disruptive physician label, which is highly subjective. There's no evidence required beyond the claim of the accuser, and they will use facial expression, and have used, tone of voice and body language to prosecute the physician. And again, I would encourage you, if you want to read the details about these are the links to these articles, and if you don't want to read the articles, you want to view the actual presentations, there's links to those too. And again, that's in your handout packet. Now, I will tell you that in general, hospitals virtually never admit that they use sham peer review. And as an expert witness, I don't usually use words like never and all because it can be problematic. But I encountered one case where I was invited into the community to explain why the little hospital in the community had lost all of their surgeons. It's because the hospital's administration had threatened them with being labeled disruptive because they complained about some things in the ICU, and so they resigned. And that left that little hospital, which was in Beeville, Texas, about 70 miles away from Corpus Christi, it left that little hospital with no surgical coverage whatsoever. And the citizens of the community wanted to know, why is that? I mean, if some surgical emergency happened, they'd have to travel 70 miles to Corpus Christi. Great, I hope you make it. And so that was held, that meeting, to explain what sham peer review was and what was going on, was held in a community college auditorium. And it was on a weeknight. And I'll tell you, it was pretty full. And after I made the presentation explaining what sham peer review was and what's going on as far as abuse of the disruptive physician label, we had a question and answer period afterwards. And a hospital advisory board member went up to the microphone during that question and answer period and said that she felt that sham peer review is a useful tool for hospitals to remove troublesome physicians, and she found a lot of benefits to sham peer review. My jaw dropped. I didn't know what to say. The physicians in the audience were absolutely shocked. You mean somebody finally admitted, yeah, we like this. It's a great way of getting rid of physicians that are they're troublesome. We want them out of there. So I want to spend just a few minutes on telling you about retaliation and sham peer review, just how bad can it get. And I will tell you that it's a lot worse than probably most of you think. And we're aware, and again, I've seen this particular tactic here from various places around the country. And what happens is these doctors, interestingly enough, seem to have great difficulties with box cutter knives being found in their tires. And so there are people, I will tell you, that know how to do this. And what it is they put a box cutter knife into the tire and they break it off. That generally does not cause the tire to go flat immediately, but you take that car out on an interstate and run at 65, 75 miles an hour, that tire can catastrophically fail and result in an accident, causing serious injury or maybe even death. Oh, look, it was just an accident. You know, the poor doctor lost control of his car, rolled over a few times. Too bad, what an unfortunate accident. But I know quite a number of sham peer review victims around the country that had this same unusual thing happen to their tires. So one of the first stories I want to tell you about briefly today is that of Dr. Raymond Long. This is an article published in our journal, Sham Peer Review, The Shocking Story of Raymond Long. Please click on it, download it from the journal, read the details, because it's absolutely appalling. This was really extreme and outrageous conduct by the hospital. This doctor is an orthopedic surgeon who specialized mainly in doing endoscopic shoulder surgeries. And he had plans to put an MRI in his office. And the hospital also had plans to get an MRI and didn't like the fact that he was going to be competing against them. Hospitals don't like competition from physicians that are outside the hospital. They don't like it at all. And when you do something to get a piece of equipment that's going to compete with them or a service that's competing with them, that's going to paint a big target on your back in some cases. And that's basically what happened in this case. Dr. Long was also aware of some violations that he believed the hospital was violating, and those violations got investigated and eventually settled. The hospital settled with the Department of Justice, and you can read what those are, the details. But there was a number of unusual events and things that began to happen after this attack and sham peer review were launched on Dr. Long. His tires of his car were slashed on 3 separate occasions with a box cutter knife. And a private investigator showed up at his parents' home in California. This orthopedic surgeon lived in Vermont. All the way across the country, all of a sudden, a private investigator ends up at his parents' home. And it was late at night, saying they were looking for Ray Long for his high school reunion. And there were a number of calls placed to his parents at odd hours, at 6 a.m. on one occasion, where they were asking, saying, look, we're looking for Ray Long. His car was also broken into on 3 occasions. Laptop, computer was stolen, briefcase stolen. His home was entered illegally on a number of occasions. And in the middle of winter, when he'd locked the windows, he'd come home and find those windows open. He'd find things moved from one place to another in his home. These generally fall under the category of what's known as gaslighting. And you can Google that term, but basically what it is, it's a psychological manipulation to make the victim seem like he's going crazy or he's paranoid, And so you can read more about it, gaslighting. And about 2 weeks after filing a lawsuit against the hospital, he had an executive and the executive's wife over to his home for conversation. And shortly after the executive's wife and Dr. Long drank a glass of orange juice, they became very ill. So Dr. Long took the orange juice to a private lab and had it analyzed. And what was found in the orange juice was mercury, lithium, and methamphetamine. And Dr. Long didn't put it there. This is also a case where the doctor had the good sense to hire an expert in infection investigations. He hired a Dr. William Jarvis, who is a former CDC prevention infection investigator who worked for the CDC for 23 years, 17 of which were spent in charge of looking into infection outbreaks in hospitals. And what he found was the organisms and I should tell you that, to back up a little bit, what happens when you want to accuse a doctor of having a post-op infection rate that's too high and the doctor doesn't have any post-op infections. What do? Well, you could create them. That's right, create them. So what was found in this case was the surgical irrigation fluids, which this doctor was using in his endoscopic shoulder surgeries, were heavily contaminated with at least 3 organisms: Staph aureus, Serratia marcescens, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa. 2 of those gram-negative, kind of unusual, wouldn't you say? Even maybe quite rare. It gets worse. Not only were those organisms found, but they were determined to be pan-sensitive. Well, what do we know about pan-sensitive bacteria? Well, they don't exist in the environment. Where do they exist? Well, they exist in biological supply houses that provide them to hospital labs so as to test their procedures. And so what was discovered in this case was those very same 3 organisms, all pan-sensitive, the hospital had purchased within weeks to a few months prior to them being found in the shoulders of these patients and found in the surgical irrigation fluids. There's some other identifying factors which I can't explain to you right now that further identify the strains of these organisms, and they're almost like fingerprints, and they were found to be identical to the organisms the hospital had purchased. And so the former CDC investigators' conclusion was that these surgical irrigation fluids, which were being used in his surgeries, were deliberately contaminated by someone in the hospital. And in 2005, a lawsuit, which had been going on for a while in this case, settled for $4 million, and the hospital CEO moved on to another job somewhere else. And I think it would have settled for a whole lot more than $4 million had this information about those organisms been known prior to the settlement. They weren't, because he hadn't hired the infection investigator until sometime after it was settled. But so that's sort of that story. There's a lot more to it. And again, I would encourage you to read that in the journal article. And since about 2011, and realize that they did a lot of other things here. I mean, Dr. Long, because the hospital wouldn't investigate the cause of these infections, took it upon himself to investigate. And one of the things he did was he took a sample of his irrigation fluids about to be used on a patient, sent it to the lab for analysis, and wow, those sterile fluids, guess what? They had bacteria in them. So he used another type of irrigation fluid that he watched being taken out of the box and hung, so it wasn't anybody that could tamper with it. And this MEC said and told him, you can no longer use those protective measures of making sure you see that the fluids come out of the box before they're hung and that things are sterilized right before you can't do that anymore. It's disruptive to the hospital procedure. So you're not allowed to do that. So they left him on call. But if he did surgery, he was going to be at their mercy of maybe using more surgical fluids which were contaminated. And they also made him get a psych evaluation, or told him he had to, because he advanced the theory that maybe someone had deliberately contaminated his surgical fluids. How crazy can that be? He must be a little impaired. So they wanted him to get a psych eval. So it's a horrible story, but he got a data bank report out of all of this, believe it or not. All of this malicious, false stuff they brought again, a data bank report. And he's been trying since 2011 to get that data bank report, the wrongful data bank report, voided. And I've been assisting his attorneys recently to do that. And we're waiting for a decision in that court case, which hopefully that will be coming soon. The next case that I'd like to go over briefly is one that happened right here in California. And that is the case of Dr. Michael Fitzgibbons. And he's an infection specialist. And what started all this in his case was the fact that he exercised his First Amendment right to oppose a particular entity purchasing a medical center on the grounds it would jeopardize patient safety. And for exercising his First Amendment right to do that, he suffered extreme and outrageous retaliation, which at times was life-threatening. In sworn testimony in this case, the president of that hospital testified against the CEO of the hospital, that the CEO of the hospital had hired a thug, a person who he testified was either mafia or mafia affiliated, and he paid him $10,000 supposedly to set up a website. Well, there wasn't any real website, and it's not going to cost $10,000 to set up a website. The money was obviously for something else, which the president of the hospital figured out. And of course, what that money was for a number of things, but to set up Dr. Fitzgibbons. And so this mafia or mafia-affiliated thug planted a pair of black gloves and a loaded gun in Dr. Fitzgibbons' car, and then made a series of 911 calls, which are on our APS website if you want to listen to them. And he was the caller, the mafia guy, was telling the police, look, there's this guy wearing a white coat, wearing black gloves, waving around a gun in traffic. It's like a major road rage incident, which never occurred. And the mafia thug in one of these 911 calls helpfully directed the police to the hospital parking lot. Yeah, the car is there. The police, of course, responded, and they went up into the hospital. And I believe Dr. Fitzgibbons was probably in the cafeteria at the time. And so here the police march into the hospital's cafeteria, and they want permission to search Dr. Fitzgibbons' car. Well, I didn't do anything wrong. I don't own any gun or black gloves like that. Sure, go ahead and search. So they went down to the parking lot, And the police thoroughly searched the car and, of course, found a pair of black gloves and a loaded gun, which were not those belonging to Dr. Fitzgibbons. Those were subsequently tested. The DNA on the inside of the gloves didn't match Dr. Fitzgibbons. There was no evidence on the gun that matched anything having to do with Dr. Fitzgibbons. But nonetheless, at the time that those items were found, he's handcuffed, taken by the police down to jail, strip searched, and left in the jail for approximately 5 hours. At the time he was released, the police had taken the car to the police impound lot. Now realize, this was after it was thoroughly searched by the police, and these black gloves and the loaded gun had been found. So when he went to pick up his car in the police impound lot, he's approaching it, he looks through the window, and there on the front seat is a whole bag of what looks like illicit drugs, probably ecstasy. And the attendant at the police impound lot wanted nothing to do with it. I don't see anything. I'm not going to testify to anything. And so it looks like somebody planted illegal drugs in his car after it had been searched by police, in police custody, in the police impound lot. And there was really the police and the DA couldn't find any reliable evidence to prosecute him on any road rage type charge, and so the charges were eventually dropped. And approximately 2 days after the DA closed the matter, Dr. Fitzgibbons' tires were slashed. And here's a picture. That's where the box cutter knife went in. And this was, of course, intended for Dr. Fitzgibbons, but he wasn't driving the car at the time that the tire catastrophically failed. His daughter was driving with 2 Japanese exchange students in the car. The tire, as you can see, did catastrophically fail, and it resulted in a rollover accident of the car. You know that rollover accidents cause either serious injury or, in some cases, death. So that's what happened. Here's a picture of the drugs that were found on the front seat of his car that weren't there before they entered the police impound lot, but there they are now. So, and again, I will tell you that this AAPS member is here today, and if you got questions, you want to ask me more specific details, why don't you stand up? Dr. Michael Fitzgibbons. So I want to close by telling you a few tips as far as fighting back and protecting yourself. Be aware of your surroundings at all time. Lock your doors. That includes your house and your car. If you're involved in a sham peer review or litigation against a hospital, check your tires on a regular basis. Very important, retain an attorney early on who is knowledgeable with respect to sham peer review. Not all attorneys are. There may not be too many who are, but you need one who is. And where it is legal to do so, you may consider carrying a concealed recorder with you at all times, because you never know when some of these individuals who are doing this against you step up in a private conversation and tell you, we're going to get you, or whatever. And you'd sure like to have that in a recording. This is one I've recommended to people. I mean, I don't have any real preferences. The DB9 Pro, it's like $20. It looks like a flash drive. Carry it in your pocket. You need to, most importantly, read and learn your rights under the medical staff bylaws. If you don't know what your rights are, you don't know if you're being steamrolled and if the hospital's violating them. You need to consider suing hospitals early on when sham peer review first begins and obtain a restraining order against disparagement and or reporting to the data bank. Recognize that once the data bank report is made, that's the damage. It either ruins or totally ends your career. And you want to do something to prevent that, particularly, in a sham peer review where it's abuse of the peer review process. There may be violating medical staff bylaws and just steamrolling you, willy-nilly. And so you need to do that to prevent the damage while all of this is being sorted out, perhaps in a court of law. And although hospital administrators may run nonprofit hospitals like they own them, guess what? Hospital administrators don't own hospitals, and these nonprofit hospitals must serve the public good. And you might emphasize the astronomical salaries that the hospital CEOs are taking from these nonprofit hospitals, sometimes a total compensation upwards toward $25 million per year. If a hospital intimidates a witness under its control, which they do, to not testify at a peer review hearing or otherwise refuses to produce a witness with relevant information under its control at the peer review hearing, go to court, obtain subpoena power to force that witness to appear at the peer review hearing. And as Andy mentioned, Andy Schlafly has been a pioneer in this effort and prevented the hospital from saying, no, you know what, these people under our, we're not going to produce them. They probably have information that's not going to be helpful to us, the hospital, and will be helpful to you, but we're not going to produce them. So Andy Schlafly deserves credit as a real pioneer in that area. And when you're involved in sham peer review, you need to request all emails of those at the hospital who had a role in the sham peer review for use in the peer review hearing and perhaps later in court. And again, there's a lot of details, things that I would recommend that you know and do, and some things not do. And these have been published again in our medical journal, Sham Peer Review, Disaster Preparedness and Defense. And there's also a video, if you'd prefer to watch the video of this same name. And again, I will tell you, I mean, I'm editor-in-chief of the journal, so I'm kind of giving a shot to the journal, but there is no other medical journal anywhere that publishes articles like this to benefit physicians whose rights are being abused. You won't find it. The other thing, again, that is unique about AAPS is we have what we call the AAPS Free Limited Legal Consultation Service, run by the nation's top attorney in sham peer review and medical board issues, Andy Schlafly. And we also have the AAPS Sham Peer Review Hotline, which I have run on a pro bono basis since 2004, the past 15 years. And I will tell you, I take calls and email contacts every single week. And doctors' careers have been saved by information they've obtained on the hotline. In particular, this piece of information. There are doctors out there that can see they're not going to get a fair shake at the peer review hearing. Everything's stacked against them. They're violating due process, fundamental fairness, and those doctors, they've had it. They want out of there. They just want to resign. Don't do it. And that's the advice I provided to these doctors. Don't do it. Hospitals love it when you do that, because within a day of resigning from the hospital, they can report you to the data bank and end your career. Moreover, since you're no longer a member of the medical staff, you no longer have any rights to any due process. No peer review hearing, no appeals. And I will tell you, hospitals love that. And sometimes they even suggest it. You know, doctor, things would go better for you if you just kind of resign. You won't have to go through all this messy peer review stuff. So these are membership benefits. And so lastly and most importantly, I would like to thank all of you for your support, because this would not be possible without your support of AAPS. Thank you very much.